shall we move into our panel discussion? Okay. Remember as we go through as well to share your questions in the chat, and we'll come back to those. So let's follow the theme of that. Let's follow the theme of that question we just asked, and I'm going to ask Thom to kick us off and tell us what your biggest challenge is right now.
Yeah. I think beyond the obvious of being the only content designer at Miro, which is a special challenge that I know I'm not alone with. I think the biggest challenge is probably the pace that Miro's scaling at, which sounds like a weird humble brag, but I don't think it's a secret. And I voted for prioritization in that slide. It's not that no one thinks that content design is a priority, although getting people to understand what content design was basically my first year at Miro. I think it's just everything's a priority, and there's so much that needs to be done and so many hires that we need to make. Hashtag Miro.com/careers if you're looking for a job. I think that's basically been the biggest challenge. It's how in a list of 20 priorities that are all the most important thing that could possibly happen, how do you even begin to get in there and say, hello, we need more resourcing in this one very particular place that you didn't even know existed a year ago. When they hired me, they were actually looking for a UX writer, and we can get into semantic debates if people are nerding out for that. So that's a bit of an uphill challenge. That's not even fair though, because I think lots of people would love to hire more content designers. It's really just a question of how can we do that in a way that's effective, which is something that I looked at the last few months talking to lots of content design leaders, especially looking at Intercom and what happened there. So that's basically where I'm at with that.
Okay, cool. So interesting, because Rebecca, you're on the other end of the spectrum in terms of team size. What's your biggest challenge right now? How does what Thom was saying, does that still resonate even though you've got a huge team?
Oh, like 100%. So we grew from 40 people when I joined in August 2019, and we're in about 110 content designers and content editors on the team at the moment. So we've grown an awful lot, but like you say, Thom, like everything is always important. And that means there's always a lot of work for us to do. And content designers are in demand now, whereas they weren't before, because I think BTE and PlusNet did not understand where the content designers added value. And we, like you, spent a good year or so just telling that story, showing those examples of where we can really add value to our product propositions and the experiences that our customers have. But to 110 people feels like it's a lot, but it's still not quite enough to do all the work that we need to do. And I think one of our biggest challenges at the moment is actually, it's a bit of a weird one, and I don't know if anybody else is experiencing it with their companies. We are based in London, and we have a lot of talent in London, but we are just about to open up some brand new offices in Birmingham. So just slightly to the north of the UK, well, not really the north, Midlands. And we can't find the talent in that space because there's not an established kind of tech community or people who've come from a content design background, and explaining to people that you don't need to have had the title content designer before to transition into a content design career. We're having to do a lot of that legwork up there because we're simply not finding that talent pool. And we've got this amazing office, and BT's investing hundreds of millions of pounds in kind of its digital future. It wants to move from becoming the massive telecommunications company that it is now to more of a tech and lifestyle company, which is a huge shift, but it needs people who are able to help explain that to our customers, and that's where we come in. But we're just not finding those people. And the Birmingham office is going to be fantastic. It's going to have world-class user research labs there, meaning our content designers who are there can be super close to the customers that they're creating for. But we're not finding them, and we're struggling, and we're putting jobs out and kind of coming back 6 weeks later and being like, okay, well, do we have to run those ads in London and the South? which is tricky because it means we have these kind of conversations with our HR teams about, well, what about fully remote working then? How has the pandemic not allowed us to really move into that space? And actually, do we need people to be in Birmingham all of the time? And so it's like, it's a real challenge to get the right people in the right locations at the moment for us. So yeah, bigger scale, but kind of a similar problem of just like being able to find that talent and justify spending on the talent in the right places.
Yeah, that's very tricky. So Sarah, you've been working with leaders for a while now. I'm really curious to hear the challenges that with the people you're working with. Are there common challenges that you see coming out again and again?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of what's already been said, I've heard as well. I think one of the things that I've really noted in working with folks in organizations that have, let's say, I've seen a lot of organizations where there's a defined content practice, whether it's a content design practice or a content strategy practice or whatever it is that they've called it. I am sitting out the naming wars personally, but what I'm seeing happening is that in a lot of organizations, there's a defined practice. It has maybe some people, maybe there's like a handful of people, kind of size depends on the organization, but where, and I think Thom mentioned this, where people have been maybe spending their first year, right, running around and trying to evangelize and get people to see the power of content work and to see content as more than, fixing some typos and cleaning up some UI text, right? And so there's been a lot of work that I've thought of as being very like people pleasy, which is to say very reactive, very like, let me show you how valuable we are. Look, we're so valuable. And that can be so effective early on. And there's a lot of good and helpful work that happens early on to sort of establish that practice. But there's this tipping point that seems to happen where the team gets more and more stretched and it's not big enough to handle all of the kind of asks that it gets. And where what's ending up happening in a lot of organizations is that content ends up in this role where it's getting cemented as sort of like a service to other parts of the org, particularly when there's not enough content design folks to actually have them embedded on every product team, right? So the quantity isn't there. And so it ends up being this kind of reactive space where it's like, okay, maybe you have like office hours or writing labs where people come to you, or it's like people coming to you to give it a pass before it goes out the door, right? Like, and it's not that those things are bad or wrong. It's just that that's such a limited purview to what content work can do for the organization. And that is where a lot of organizations get stuck, because that's the way, like, that's sort of what they've been taught to think of their content practices offering, because that is what that first year was about, was like, we can help. Look how much better we made it. We helped. And to get to a place where I think leaders struggle a little bit is this place where they have to go from saying like, look how valuable we are by being everywhere and helping wherever needed, to saying, look how valuable we are. Here is our perspective. Here is our strategic look at sort of like what we can offer, and to actually bring a strong point of view for their practice around here are the most important places that we should be focusing. And to do that, you have to start saying no. You have to start saying no to some of the little requests that come in, particularly if you do want to grow. A lot of times getting a head count requires like, people have to feel the pinch that you're not always available to them. And so that transitional moment to get out of sort of people pleasing and into having a stronger perspective as a leader, I think it's a big hurdle for folks. And I think it's where a lot of content design teams that I'm seeing are at right now.
I call it the content trap, where it's just this cycle that you end up in because you don't have enough content designers, you're too stretched. So product designers start work early and just assume the content designer is busy, so they make their best guess and then they hand it over, and the content designer is only doing surface level changes. They're not really showing the value they add. Because they don't show the value they add, there's no investment in the team, and it's just like this endless sort of cycle. I saw someone described it the other day, I can't remember who it was, but they called it peanut butter content, because you're only like just kind of spreading something across the surface. And it's so true. And I also think like I'm interested to know, like, these sort of challenges, they then become blockers in themselves to kind of getting to meaty stuff and solving the bigger problems and becoming kind of properly embedded in design as a discipline. And I'm sort of, I know that's definitely a blocker for smaller teams that are more stretched, but even in bigger teams, I'm kind of keen to know what the other big blockers are in your organization to content designers being able to provide maximum value or do their best work. So I'm going to start with you on that one, Rebecca, because you've got a big content team at BT.
I mean, there's lots of things that stop us doing our very best version of the work, I think. And that will be, I think it's the comment that Jane made very early on in the call of like, get your content designer in on day one. Still, we may have 100 people that are obviously and visibly doing content design work, but it still relies on us being at the forefront of someone's mind when they're spinning up a new squad. We follow kind of the old Spotify squads and tribes and alliances model, and making sure that we've got that content designer in the multidisciplinary team, in the budget lines, so we know we're bringing them in on day one for kickoff of something brand new. That relies on us having done a lot of legwork to be at the forefront of people's minds, because we do the work that is quite oftentimes very invisible when it's done well. It's really tough to kind of embed that thinking that you need the right kind of person as well, and we're not just filling the budget line with like any old content designer. We have people who are very good at kind of acquisition content and more sales driven stuff and stuff that might be more customer service related, and kind of the tone and the empathy and the research that they'll have previously done and built up into this body of experience is really important that we're applying that in the right place. So making sure we're in the room early is still a barrier. But I would say at the moment, our biggest, with the scale that we've grown at, to get this kind of excellence in the actual content that we're creating, that's really tough. Consistency across the board. Like I don't, as the head of content, I don't see every piece of content that goes out, nor would I want to, because I would be a massive blocker. But the assignments, as I say, are really varied, and it can be difficult to make sure that we are employing the brand voice in the right way across the content, making sure that everything is as user-friendly as possible. Does it meet our accessibility requirements? All of that is a big piece of work, and in terms of kind of getting to that point of consistency and high quality at scale is really tough. So we've had to spend kind of a lot of effort on, basically, it's actually been easier this last year, redirecting budget that we might have spent on kind of fancy conferences and sending people off to do kind of in-person training courses, redirecting that into our more in-house training. Rachel, for example, has been helping us develop some in-house content design training. We've been spending a lot more time doing kind of Adobe Analytics training and upskilling the content designers to make sure that at the moment they are deployed on day one, they have all of the skill set that the rest of their multidisciplinary team has and expects them to have and is ready to go. And there's lots of work that we've done to move people away from kind of customer facing content more recently into more of our platform teams. So teams that are developing a design system, so we can create some content patterns and guidelines that mean we can scale that up pretty quickly, and we can make sure that people are doing the right stuff at scale, and then things aren't dropping, kind of slipping through the net. But it's a tough one, and making sure that when we learn a lesson in content design and we make a decision about a particular way of doing things, that we communicate that to our entire community is still pretty tough. And I guess working remotely over the last year hasn't helped that. So you've got to be really proactive in being like, we discovered a thing, we learned a thing, this is how we're going to change what we do in future, and then telling everyone about it. For our content community, it's a little bit hard because lots of us are naturally more introverted, but you're like, it's really pays to talk and tell people when you've done a thing and you've done it well. So that's where we kind of embed that guidance and make sure we are doing things well across the board, but it's tough.
I'm wondering, with Thom being the president of content in your organization and not having that whole community to manage, is it easier or harder for you where you are for ensuring things like consistency and making sure you're in the right conversations?
I would say it's both. It's easier in the sense that I have an actual destabilizing amount of power sometimes. Sometimes I'll make what I think is an offhand comment in Slack, and then it just gets changed across the business. And I go, someone should have said something about that. Someone should have responded to that in some way. So that's quite interesting. And then in other ways, it's of course impossible for me to be involved in a lot of conversations that are going on. Actually, I wanted to touch on something that Sara brought up about demonstrating value. I think it can be quite a zero-sum game to try and link your content design practice in your company to things like moving the needle, as they say, especially if your company is growing at any kind of scale. Like I don't think I have self-esteem issues, but I think there's nothing I could do at Miro that would make any noticeable difference to the rate that we're growing. And so if I tie the idea of content design or the need of content design to A/B testing growth, experiments, I will never be able to show any kind of value. Luckily, no one's asked me to do that. And so there's an interesting question about how do you, and I'm sure everyone in this call thinks about this on a regular basis, how do you demonstrate value? And what value are you even trying to demonstrate? And the other thing that I think is tied to that is, what do content designers do where you are? I'm guessing that the content designers at BT cover a range of things that I would never touch because we have other writers. I don't want to come across like I'm producing all the words at Miro. I'm not. We have content marketers. We have people doing a lot of different writing. We have comms writers. So, but in some places, content designers do a lot of that, which changes the dynamic of a conversation that you're saying, how do you hire more content designers? Well, what do your content designers do? Like, what are they responsible for? What should they be responsible for? And is that even a bucket that you can even define? I bet on this call, if we did a poll of everybody here and said, what do you do at your job? We would get a list so large that it would go, what is content design even? Now, we don't all want to have existential crises, so we probably shouldn't do that. But that's also a challenge. Like, I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that internally we don't really have a set, but that's the nature of the business, right? Like if you ask what do UX designers do? Are there even UI designers anymore? It's really kind of amazing how quickly everything's moving. And yet we try and act like we've been doing this for like centuries. It's like a lot of this, we've not even defined, the rough outline of what we're trying to do. And now we're trying to like go in with the granularity of like individual job titles. It's quite fascinating. I don't know if I went way off topic there, but that was just what was on my mind. I'm sorry.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think you're right. I mean, all of our organizations are different and all of our roles are different. And I think, as much as you have different flavors of product designer or UI designer or UX designer, you have different flavors of like content people. We're all doing different things, and we don't necessarily need to, I think to the point earlier, we don't necessarily need to label ourselves. We're just getting shit done. Does it really matter what we're called? We're all doing, and what works in one organization isn't going to work in another. But I think it's interesting that you were saying about, sometimes you sort of have a kind of unwielding amount of power, like, with great power comes great responsibility. But I mean, like, it's really exciting for you because you're almost like there setting that kind of foundations and groundwork for the growth of a whole discipline at Miro. So that must be kind of exciting, as well as probably a little bit intimidating at times.
It was especially interesting to try to do that last year without meeting anyone that I worked with. I didn't meet a person that I worked with for 11 months. So that was quite weird. But I would say that I think there's an interesting approach, and I have no idea if it's the right one. And if you think it's the wrong one, maybe don't tell me. I'm a little committed to this approach, but it has a lot to do with like basically what value does a content designer bring that could be translated into a skill set that someone else could reasonably utilize in the work that they're doing. I don't mean to say that like I came up with it. Obviously I didn't. But in talking to a lot of different content design leaders in other organizations, I did this thing where I just went out and chatted to a lot of them. and a consistent through line other than trying to get headcounts, trying to tell people what you do, constantly advocating for what it is you even do, which was shocking to me, actually. Maybe I'm very naive, but to hear that Slack has to constantly tell Slack what its content designers do was like, but you're Slack. you're the ones, you're like the chosen team. But that's, like Andrew Schmidt there said that half of his job is just telling people at Slack what content designers do. And I'm like, I can't believe that. It almost made me think maybe I don't want to be a content designer. If you have to tell people what content designers do, then maybe this isn't the thing. But to wrap it up quickly, so I thought part of the approach is to try and like distill that in some way and disseminate that amongst Miro, because they kind of have to do it. They're gonna here's the secret that isn't a secret. Whether I look at it or not, whether anyone touches it, it's going out. Like there's no stopping the train. So it's not, and it's not like I can go, see, it would have been 0.1% better if you had engaged a content designer. So that kind of has to get out there anyway. I don't know if that makes me feel powerful. It kind of just makes me feel frazzled. Is that the opposite of power? Whatever the opposite of powerful is, that it isn't just weak. That's how I'm feeling.
Okay, I've been in that position before at a company where you're trying to do so many things and also build a team, and it's just really tough, because at the same time you're not getting time to put all those kind of operational foundations in place. And actually, Sarah, I wanted to ask you, because when you wrote Content Everywhere, you talk about a lot of those operational aspects and how important they are, and that was quite a few years ago now, and many companies are still not really thinking about how important it is to get those operational foundations in place, which obviously can alleviate some barriers later on and help teams sort of work more efficiently and effectively. And I was kind of wondering whether 10 years later we're still struggling in organizations to even think about those barriers. And I was just wondering if you feel like that's sort of quite frustrating in some ways.
It's funny, as you're talking about that, I'm like, what does that book say? What did I write? I haven't opened it in a while. I think that over the past 10 years, I mean, it's been sort of like, I think, a really massive sort of upswing for content folks, but it's been, ups and downs along the way. And I do think that, the operational bit is still really challenging for a lot of different reasons. I think one of them is that so much has shifted sort of like industry-wide. If you're looking at like the tech industry, however you want to define that at this point, or like the digital efforts of different organizations, like so much has changed at that macro scale that means that content has changed a lot, and sort of the role of content within these organizations and what's needed has changed a lot. And so everything feels like in kind of constant state of flux. Plus you've still got, lots of folks who are just coming around to the idea of content as being an essential part of the design process or an essential part of the service. And I guess what I keep thinking about is this challenge of kind of advocacy and evangelism that I think is still really there, that I maybe thought, to be honest, like 10 years ago, I think if you'd asked me, imagine 10 years from now, there's like massive content teams at all of these organizations. I would not have guessed that we would be still having as many discussions about evangelizing and advocacy. I would have thought that like, oh, well, if there's this many content people with content jobs and content leadership roles and big companies, then like the advocacy job is done. And I think what I've realized is that despite the massive growth, it's still early in the field in a lot of ways. And so there is still a lot of education to do and a lot of just figuring out how to make this work and how to make it fit. I've seen content teams get shuffled from one part of the org to another. Are they within design? Are they outside of design? Are they like, who do they report up into? I've seen teams go from being like dotted line to 3 different places to then being pulled under this other. And I think that some of that is corporate wrangling. Some of that is a legitimate kind of tug of war between different things because content touches so many areas.
Yeah.
And I guess something that I think is also big that actually Jane mentioned in the chat is that, you know, over the past few years, you're seeing a huge growth in like in-house product focused content people. That means that even though the discipline has been maturing for a lot longer than that, the discipline within organizations is actually an in-house capacity is very new in a lot of places. I mean, a lot of like big tech companies started having content designers 2 or 3 years ago. It's just not that long. So, so I do think there's a lot that's just not at a level of maturity yet. The one thing I wanted to say though, I wanted to come back to something Thom had mentioned about sort of the energy and the frazzledness of doing all of this evangelizing and advocacy work. I really think that there's a strong degree of sort of like martyrdom that content folks can pick up in this process. And I would also encourage all of you to really think about that and to think about how much of that you want to take on. Oftentimes you don't end up in this field necessarily because you're like, that looks easy or fun, although it might look like that. There's also a sense, I think, a little bit of calling to it because it is still sort of emergent, that sense of like, oh, I'm going to go in and fight for this thing because I care about it. That's a wonderful and beautiful thing, but that is a limited resource for each of us, right? Like to go in and be like, I'm going to fight this good fight. Nobody has an endless capacity for that. And I think some of us have been building practices that rely on us always having that attitude. I'm going to go in and fight that good fight. And I think it has led to some unsustainable levels of advocacy and evangelism in organizations that, you know, just because the content absolutely could be better and just because it is good and right for the content to be better doesn't mean that you can take on all of that. And if the organization is slow to move and the organization is slow to sort of to really recognize the value of what you bring, it's not all on you to make that happen, even though it can feel that way. And I think it can really feel that way when you are in a leadership role where you're trying to grow a team, where you're trying to protect those few people you have below you, you're trying to get your head count. It's like, it can feel like a huge amount of pressure on you to fix it. And I would just encourage everyone to really take a look at like, how much of that is actually viable for you and how much energy do you want to put toward that right now, and allow yourself to put some limits on it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something I've been thinking a lot about lately. You know, there's only so many years you can fight the good fight for before you wonder whether it's actually, you know, your energy is better invested in, you know, other things, doing other things, you know, not saying not content related, but, you know, I think we've got to move with how the world around us shifts as well. And for everything we, you know, for every little step we take, the goalposts move or the landscape shifts. And so it's like a continual effort to kind of keep that up. And it's just, like you say, it's just not sustainable. My next question actually was, we talked a bit earlier about kind of the blockers and priorities, and I'm just kind of coming back to this, like, not necessarily advocacy, but in our businesses we are often not great at, you know, we're really good at working in silos. We're not great at thinking about how we connect content across an organization and how we bring some of those other content functions that you mentioned together. There can obviously sometimes be a bit of tension, like that's my job. So I just wondered, in the organizations you're in, or in the organizations you've worked with, what have you seen work well in breaking down those silos and trying to bring people together for that more holistic view of content? I'll start with Thom on that one.
Well, I mean, having some kind of executive champion is usually one of the most useful things you can have. I think that's probably the easiest way. If you can just have someone who's in a high enough position to mandate it, then you're going to have a much better time. You know, it's so fascinating listening to the conversation, and I agree with everything Sara just said. It certainly plays out for different roles. Like, I think maybe we all get attracted to that. There's a little bit of that, you know, just a little bit, You know, like the teacher is very much that as well. Like who on earth would take that job? I did it for 5 years, and it was really, I mean, it was very informative, but I have no idea why I was doing it now that I think back on it. I think in terms of things that worked, it's, you gotta have, I think you need to be, you need to be able to pull a lot of different threads. I think one of the things, here's the thing, because it's usually there's not that many content designers, indeed maybe only one sometimes, you tend to be one of the few people that works across the business. If you have a business of a certain size that you can actually work across from. And as we all know, and I bet Rebecca even has this as a thing, because when you get to a certain size, it's basically like you have, you know, different limbs, just not even, with no central nervous system. It's like you literally don't know what the left hand's been up to. And sometimes it's those people like content designers who sit on a lot of teams, you know, who are cross-functional and sit on a lot of teams, who can see what's going on in one place and going, hang on, we're going to do what change there? I'm pretty sure that'll break something that's over here. And you're the one that goes over and says, hey, you talk to marketing, you talk to brand, and you're like, they're thinking of putting 3 things in there. And I'm pretty sure one of our main value propositions is that we have one of those things. Not speaking from any kind of personal history. And that to me is the most useful way of showing people that you have, like, of getting that kind of collaboration going, is it's just by literally the fact that you work across the business, you have that insight. Now, that kind of implies that there should be people who have that role in a company that aren't a content designer, but like, what would you even call that role? And I guess we sort of assume that that's happening, but in most places I've been in, that super isn't. And even as everyone goes, silos bad, we don't have silos. It's like, then how come there's walls everywhere and we can't look over them? It's like, those aren't silos, those are farms. So I think that in a way is been, yeah, that's been definitely the way that's been the most useful in terms of like people going, ooh, this Thom guy's kind of useful because he was sitting in this meeting because he had to. Now he's in this other meeting because who else would sit in that meeting? And now he knows this information but again, that's pretty unsustainable. I think you can't really keep that up for too long, but maybe that would get enough more people coming in that way.
Yeah, I've definitely played that role in organizations before, where I feel like I'm the connector and like the linchpin between all these different departments, and people actually do start coming to you because they know you've got that knowledge. But then you say, like you say, after a while, that's just not sustainable. And unless you've got that top-down exec kind of role, bringing that all together in some sort of strategic way, it will only last so long before it kind of just goes back into those like little pockets again. Rebecca, at BT, what have you seen work well to kind of bridge some of those organizational gaps?
I think we've had to do a real combination of the strategic and the tactical. And I guess this kind of comes from a bit of my background working in Parliament and working in government. And one of the ways that you get things done when you're working in government is go and speak to the minister who is responsible for the thing and get some airtime with them and just get in a room. And I think that, and it's not sustainable at scale, but chasing down the most influential person and finding a reason to spend time with them, so they get to know where you add, where your skills are and where you add value, and then come to you at a later date. So a little bit of like, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So a good example of that is at BT recently. We've been working between our legal teams. We have to be very cautious around kind of regulation. The like industry regulation comes and changes. We work with lots of different partners who are selling devices, so we don't want to piss off Apple because we've created some content that's upset them, but we also need to meet our own guidelines. There's lots of different legal type conversations going on, and quite often we'll get to a point of, we don't want to be in a position where we're signing off content, but we do need to make sure our legal stakeholders are happy with how we might be phrasing something. And traditionally that's been a very much like lob it over the fence, see if they say yes. It is a bit kind of, yeah, it is a sign off essentially. We wanted to move away from that and be much more collaborative with our legal teams, but they're very time poor people. So one of the managers, the content design managers who sit underneath me, he spent some time thinking, what's the best way for us to really make sure they know why we're here, what we're doing, and how we're doing it? And then went to our director of legal and basically proposed a pair writing session with him over some terms and conditions around a particular proposition, and just said, look, we know that our customers are finding this, the research shows that they can't comprehend what this means for them, and we know we want to make it simpler and shorter, but we want to make sure we're doing this in the right way. And you're the most knowledgeable person in the whole of BT about this thing, really kind of playing up to their ego. Being like, if you could spend half an hour in a room just pair writing with us, we'll sit next to you, we'll take it in turns to essentially work through these terms and conditions and simplify them. And so he did that, and he spent that time with the director of legal, and came out of that session and not only had actually basically rewritten some terms and conditions around one of our broadband propositions, which was useful to take back to the team and say, we've agreed this and this is all good. But in that session, use that time to explain content design, to demonstrate it to somebody who would benefit from it. And then that person becomes an advocate for you and then goes out to the rest of their team and says, well, next time that the content design team come to you and ask for something, put them to the front of the queue, because working with them is a dream, because they make what you're saying easier to understand. They can simplify things but still appreciate the nuances of the legality and the legalese that we do need to sometimes include, but can strip back entirely in certain places. And suddenly you do have somebody who is much more senior saying, get these people in, like they know what they're up to. And I think that's really, it's been really important to kind of break down those silos. It certainly doesn't work in all areas. Like I don't, maybe we got the legal team, the director of legal on a really good day. We haven't been able to manage like replicating that with our marketing director, for example, but we have done with brand and we have done with propositions, and we've done the same thing. We've picked the person that we think is going to be the most vocal advocate for us and shown them what we can do by essentially like buddying up to them until like pestering until they give in and understand how glorious it is to work with the content designer. But yeah, that really works, because it means they see you, you're showing you're seeing how they work and understanding a little bit about their point of view as well. And it's that give and take, and that can really help and stick around. But like I said, it's not the con of that is that it's not particularly sustainable, because when that person moves jobs, you may have to start that all over again, unless you've done it well enough that the entire team has then seen that in you.
Yeah. What I found worked really well before is get some of those different departments into a big sort of day-long workshop and map out the entire end-to-end experience, and then get everybody to see where the inconsistencies are, or where there's problems with content that actually could have been resolved by working closer together. Because I think it just helps people have that, oh yeah, we probably need to speak more often, or we probably need to communicate better about these things. It just helps them kind of see that from a customer experience point of view and the impact that can have on the end experience. I'm interested, Sarah, what tips have you got for people who are in an organization like that and need to kind of maybe break down some organizational barriers, but feel a bit anxious about kind of approaching people who might feel threatened by this new team that are also writing content? How do you advise people to sort of approach those situations?
So specifically approaching groups that are also producing content, but perhaps not from a UX lens or content design lens. Yeah, I tend to think that there's a lot about this that's not really about content. It's really about like, how do we communicate at a very fundamental level? It's like, okay, well, one of the things I would say is, if you come in with a perspective of like, I have this special knowledge, I've got it figured out, right? And those people don't get it. That's probably a very frustrating place to be. And I mean, like I've lived in that place. I know what that feels like. And it's not that it's like, there's elements of truth to it where it's like, you do have a special knowledge other people don't have. And there is value to this work that people don't recognize. I mean, those are true things. But I think when you show up with that kind of lens on the situation, you're really setting yourself up for conflict. And you're setting yourself up to basically put it as like an us versus them. And anytime you're setting up for an us versus them, you're making the road a little bit harder for yourself and probably harder for everybody too. So what I would say is that the very first thing is to really say, okay, how do I come at different folks with like some sense of what are our shared values? What are our shared goals? How can I understand where they're coming from? Because oftentimes I try to look at it as like, you have a perspective, like everybody has a perspective. There is unfortunately not really any objective reality. All of us like to think that there's an objective reality and that it is ours. And in fact, there isn't really one. And so to be able to say, okay, I'm coming at this with a perspective. My perspective is born of some expertise. And that expertise is real and that expertise is valid. And it is just one way of seeing things. And so can I open myself up to seeing some other perspectives on this? Can I open myself up to understanding how the things got to how they are, and that probably a lot of people were making the best choices they could at the time, or a lot of people were using the knowledge they had. And sometimes, like, if we just abandoned all of that expertise for my expertise, we'd lose some stuff too, right? It's like, so to really look at it and say, okay, I want to get curious here. So if I can open up and I can get really curious about what's making them tick, what are the pain points they've been experiencing, what are they thinking about as they're producing this stuff, then I can have a lot more opportunity to understand what their needs are and help them understand what I do in a way that's going to make sense to them. So I think the very first thing is like, can you move from a place of judgment and coming at it as like a conflict to win, to a place of, okay, I want to understand these folks. I'm curious about them. And I want them to benefit from my expertise and vice versa. And I think when you can do that, there is a much greater likelihood of having productive conversations. And productive conversations don't mean that content design is always going to win. That gets you right back into the sense of competition. And instead to say, like, we're going to be able to, like, the more that we can understand each other, the more long-term, I think, benefit everybody is going to feel. And I think that is hard to do if you have developed, this sense of like, that I think is really common in a newer field of like us against the world, or we need to go in there and show them how it is or whatever, right? Like, it's easy to get into that mindset, and that mindset really sets you up to be defensive. And I just think that tends to, it's like that at the very beginning, that some of that can help us like rally a community of like, yeah, that's us, we're those people. But it is not a place to build long-term relationships from.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. I'm going to move into some questions actually from the audience. So I think we've got some interesting questions here. So I've got a question from Mike, and he wants to know, is anyone working somewhere that's encouraging or mandating a return to in-office work? And if you are, how are you handling sort of team morale, retention, attrition challenges? I would start with you on that one, Thom, because I don't know what things are like at Miro right now. You're in the Netherlands, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, as you might imagine, that's an ongoing and continuous discussion, particularly with things changing constantly. So we have, I'm going to get this wrong, but we have something like 7 or 8 hubs. They're in the US, Amsterdam, Berlin. We have an office in Perm, which is where Miro was started in Russia. And so all of those have different requirements for going back and different rollout plans, et cetera. But we are beginning to require people to go back. And the reasoning behind that is a lot to do with the kind of way that Miro perceives its culture and the way that we think people work better together. So we are not going to go fully remote. We don't have a fully remote policy. Is that impacting hiring? Is that impacting retention? I'm going to guess yes. I mean, I think there's a general movement towards that. Now, will we revisit it? Should we not be able to make our hiring goals? Possibly. But I think I'm not going to have a lot to offer here in terms of how we're managing it. I think no one remembers what it was like to work in an office, because we basically hired 60% of our staff during the lockdown. We don't know what it's like to work together. We don't know anything about that. So in some ways, people are super excited to get back to an office and just see some people face to face and have, like, maybe the work day ends and you, I don't know, really novelly go out and have a drink somewhere together. It's I think we have genuinely underestimated the effect that's had on being able to work. Just all of these tiny little things that you could do from an office. So right now, I think people are just way more excited about being in an office. We'll see how long that lasts. Yeah. we could get back in an office and like, oh yeah, we hated this.
The novelty will wear off pretty quick.
Yes, exactly. But so far, that's the way Miro's handling it, by just rolling it out gently. I think we are going to a 60%. I don't know why I'm using percentages for work weeks. My brain's broken. 3 days 3 days minimum in the office. You can have 2 days not in the office. So there is going to be that kind, I guess the sexy word's hybrid. We're going to have a hybrid work week. And I think that is kind of what most people, at least that I talk to, and certainly from my perspective, I think that works for me, having that kind of now codified flexibility. That's probably a contradiction in terms, but that's what we're going with.
I was just thinking about when you were saying that, actually, and I was just wondering, Sara, are you having to, with the leadership coaching, do you have to sort of almost like adapt the way you're coaching people? Like, are people coming to you and saying, I need help because I'm finding it really hard to, I don't know, navigate my organization remotely? Is this whole like move towards remote working having a really big impact on how leaders are working?
I think it is having a big impact on how they're working. I think that it's not usually explicit in the issues that people are bringing to me. Maybe it's come up for sure, but it's often not the explicit thing. I think that what is actually happening for a lot of people is that it's maybe like exacerbated in a pre-existing issue, and sort of made it clear, like, gosh, like this is not working, right? I think that there were a lot of things between remote work and this sort of like pandemic stress in general. I think what we're really seeing is a lot of stuff that was not working about work becoming much more obvious how broken it was. And so I would say that one of the big things that I see that I think that remote work has really highlighted, not necessarily created, but highlighted, is how much of a challenge there is in a lot of organizations around sort of a sense of powerlessness. And when I think about, in a lot of companies, I mean, even amongst people who have leadership roles, even amongst people who have theoretically a fair amount of institutional power, they can still feel very powerless when it comes to the ways the winds shift and sort of directives that come down from above. And I think over the course of the pandemic, what you've seen is a general sense of powerlessness on a much greater scale too, right? Like a lot of like, this is a global thing that is happening to all of us that will end someday. And we can make some personal choices, but it doesn't feel like a great sense of power. And I think what I'm finding is that specifically around the kind of going back to work, getting back to the office thing, is that people, when that feels like something that is being done to you, that just exacerbates this existing problem of powerlessness. And so what I'm advocating with people, and this is beyond, well beyond any content specific thing, but what I'm really advocating is like, yes, you can have plans to get back to the office, but we really need to be thinking about how do we give people some sense of autonomy? And that doesn't mean that you have to be able to do remote forever, although I would advocate for a lot of organizations that think that they can't have 100% remote to maybe think about that more carefully. But I think that what it absolutely does mean is people need some autonomy to decide about like how quickly can they go back into the office and how do they kind of like work their way back up to it, right? Jumping back into like, and I'm an office person now, can be very jarring for people. There's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable with that. There's a lot of people who have legitimate health concerns still, or concerns about family care. There are also people who maybe they're just dealing with a lot of like pandemic anxiety, even if they don't have a specific reason that they're not comfortable because they've been stuck in their homes for 16 months. And like, right, like it takes time to readapt. And I think that there is a piece of this that's like, let people have some say over how things are going to work for them. Give them lots of notice about changes, give them some flexibility. If you are expecting them back in the office, let's say 3 days a week, then perhaps you can say something like, and I can't remember, there was a large company that just did this where they have a rollout period where it's like, hey, so starting in January, we're going to expect you to be at 3 days a week in the office. And so we're going to ask you, you can start ramping up to that on a schedule that works for you. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the big reasons I would say for organizations is just that from kind of like an organizational resilience perspective, if people continue to feel this powerless at work, they will quit. We're already seeing a huge number of people leaving. I mean, I just saw that the resignation rate in the United States in May was the highest it has ever been in any recorded history. People are leaving their jobs. Yeah, I mean, and that's the truth, is because there are opportunities in our fields, there are opportunities. And so to look at that and to say, if you think that now is the time to like tell people how it's going to be, they're going to tell you how it's going to be. And so I would really say, like, the more that we can think about some of these return to office plans with a sense of flexibility and some grace for folks to figure out what's going to work for them, I think the better. So that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm telling a lot of leaders right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's such an interesting time. It's sort of, I'd say, I hate the word unprecedented, but it is, like, in terms of like workforce and the ways of working and how people are just starting to make, like, having these realizations and make, not being afraid to make these big life changes. So Mike said it's being called the Great Resignation. It's kind of crazy. Rebecca, have you seen the move to remote? Because we're sort of fully remote at the moment at BT. You can go to the office if you want to, but you haven't, we're not being forced into it. But have you seen the move to sort of fully remote over the last year? Has it had an impact on the way teams are working, or the kind of satisfaction for the team members?
I mean, it's definitely had an impact on the way teams are working, for sure. I mean, we've recruited a lot of people during the last kind of 18 months. And I don't envy those people and maybe people on this call have done the same thing, but people who start jobs remotely, like, that's tough. That's tough for you as a new starter, but it's tough for you as a company as well. You've got to really go out of your way to make new folks feel welcome, to make sure they're set up with kind of onboarding plans that mean they actually get visibility of people who they might have previously only just bumped into. You need to actively set up introduction sessions to a lot more people to make sure they kind of get value out of their first couple of weeks and really do understand, like, the lay of the land at an early stage. In terms of, like, actual ways of working, a lot more collaboration, a lot more use of tools like Miro and Mural and other tools that allow designers, product designers and content designers to work really closely together, be in the same room online, and have kind of a real-time sharing of ideas is definitely, like, the uptake of those kind of technologies has been like essential to us kind of succeeding over the last 12 months. What's Mural, says Tom. Sorry, Tom. I think one of the big kind of areas where we've had to really kind of, like, change our attitude and really kind of step up is that, like I say, that early onboarding. But like you said, Rachel, we're not forcing anybody to go back to the office. There's no mandate from BT to say you must go back to the office. And certainly, although I mentioned earlier that we're not going to kind of like a fully remote way of working, there's definite hints that our team and the people who make those decisions about where we work, it's shifting from you must be in the office 2 days a week to if you want to be in the office 2 days a week. And it's been tricky for people, I think. Our managing director, for example, he's taken to coming to kind of all hands meetings from the back of his camper van, and he's moved to Devon, and he's like a full advocate for everybody working as flexibly as they can do in ways that suit them. And actually, there's some questions about whether that's sensitive to people who are living in London, younger members of our team who've been in a pandemic and have been working from a shared house and have had one room to, like, eat, sleep and work in, and then they're seeing your big boss dial in from a tent or a camper van and looking pretty chill about
Yeah,
it.
Rebecca.
Is that appropriate? But I think there's definitely, like, with the tools that we've been able to adapt, and now we've done that onboarding of new people and we've done it again and we've learned from it again, I think satisfaction with people who are joining us is high. Retention has been pretty high, but I think we're also bracing ourselves for that moment where people go, okay, is BT really committed to flexible working then? Can I work in other locations? If you're opening fancy new offices with fantastic facilities there, are you going to make us go into them because you paid money for them when we actually want to have a far more flexible lifestyle? And I think there will be a little bit of conflict. And I think, Sara said, we're going to have to listen to our people, because if we start dictating that you must be visible in a physical office half of your working week, that's not going to work for a lot of people. And expectations are changing, and we need to rise up and meet those expectations and do a little bit better. And yeah, why would you take away something like a great set of like remote working tools? You can't artificially now remove those from people's lives and say you can't use that anymore. You've got to be sitting in the office. There's no more teleconferencing. Zoom's not appropriate, whatever it might be. We're not going to do that. So people are going to want to work in the way that suits them.
I've found that actually, like it's like Zoom calls and workshops, I found is a great leveler, because where people that might previously have been, you know, felt a bit intimidated being in the same room as, you know, a director or an MD, and like maybe not speaking up, you know, now everyone's just a floating head on a screen, and you know, we're all moving post-its around Miro boards. It feels like it's just a bit of a leveler for people.
One of the great bits of feedback I had from a new starter was it's so much easier to know who everyone is when you can hover over their name, see their name and job title, and as you're trying to piece together the organization as a new starter, you don't have to go and interrogate everyone. The information's right there for you to go and find. And I think that's, I mean, that's a good way to get a head start.
Yeah, there's none of the kind of forgetting people's names when I started, because it was always on screen. So yeah, that was great. Okay, my next question is from, I'm not sure, someone called Essay, I'm not quite sure who that is, but they want to know how you promote the work of a content design team who might be incorrectly seen as slowing down processes inside performance marketing department, who are creating high turnover link building content and SEO. Oh, that's a good old challenge, is how we kind of, you know, merge the two disciplines of content design and SEO. Sara, you must have come across that in some of the organizations you've worked with.
I read that question and I don't think so. I mean, I guess I don't work with a lot of organizations that are really focused on something like performance marketing and SEO. I think that that's a really big challenge. I mean, I don't actually, I would love to hear what other folks think about it. I guess from my perspective, I think that there's a lot of, you've got folks kind of at cross purposes there a bit. And if your organization is truly valuing like quick win performance marketing and SEO campaigns, the kinds of things that you are going to be thinking about from a content design perspective are probably pretty different to that. I think part of it is like that, it sounds like that culture may not actually be ready for content design or for content design to really thrive. Which is something you may want to consider. I think the other thing I might mention is like, you know, what I would look for is where are there shared goals, and to try to lead from that place. But I do think that there's a lot of dissonance there. And if that is truly what is valued, I think that it's going to be difficult to make content design work feel like it is part and parcel with that, because in a lot of ways it is not. And that, you know, that might be a reality about like, is that a place where the work that you need to do to evangelize is personally worth it to you, is a question that I might be asking. But I don't know enough about the situation to have a great answer there.
Okay. And Thom, so at Bulb, if I'm correct in thinking that when you were at Bulb, all the content team were just across all channels. So that must have been, was that something that you had to deal with there from a kind of SEO and performance marketing point of view?
No.
Okay.
When I started at Bulb, I was once again the only content designer, and I think we were doing a lot of outsourcing at the time when I joined the team. Okay. But I will say that at Miro, we do have a team specifically around SEO, and I think SEO is such a kind of dark magic. Like I really I mean, I think it's undeniably important. Like I'm not here to say that, you know, who needs SEO? I mean, obviously we need SEO. The rules change constantly, and I would never want to have to keep up with it. And we did have consultants come in from time to time at Bulb to try and talk to us about it. And I could feel my brain trying to crawl out of my head and like wander off down the hallway. But I think maybe the answer is in that the principles of content design, whatever principles you're working towards, should always be followed, regardless of whether or not your goal is SEO. I think I usually defer to the SEO team. If they tell me like something is necessary for SEO purposes, I can't stand there and go, well, but that word is wrong, or users don't understand it, or come in with my reckons. But generally speaking, I still try and make sure that the principles that we're hoping to apply by providing like the answer first, or by speaking in the language of our users, or however you codify what you're doing at your organization. And I think there's always a place for that. If your mere presence is seen as like a blocker or you know, I think some organizations that's just going to be the case no matter what team you're on. I don't think it's a content design specific issue. I mean, I've been in some places where like engineering was seen almost like a blocker, and it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Like without them, we can't build what we're trying to make. They're not blocking us. They're literally the way that this happens. So, you know, I think that to me, if I'm understanding maybe the tenor of the question correctly, that might be like a management and product management issue more than a content design versus SEO issue. Like if that's the way it's being kind of like managed, and I have a lot of sympathy for that, because I don't think that's an unusual situation. Then that's probably not something that's just solved by thinking about like, what can content design do with SEO and what can SEO do with content design. I would say happily, I don't have that problem too often at Miro. And I should say, I've been having these like echoes in the back of my brain. Miro is very content design positive. I don't want to come here and make it sound like we're like against any part of it. Like I'm very lucky. People understand mostly what I'm trying to do, and usually it's been my inability to explain things that have gotten in the way. But yeah, that sounds to me more like a project management, or a managerial issue than necessarily those two disciplines.
I'm going to come to you last, Rebecca, because Rebecca actually manages the content design and SEO team. So, I mean, I've only been at BT for a year, but I'm sort of interested to know how those two came together and how we've built such a strong sort of in-house team, because, you know, as Thom said, like it can be often seen as a bit of a dark art, the SEO side of things, whereas actually,
yeah, I don't believe that. I think SEOs try and make it sound like a dark art. It's not that difficult. Oh, come on, it's not that hard. Yeah, I feel a bit like a cheat. If I was thinking of an answer to that question, my answer to the question would be become the boss of the SEO team, and then you'll see how you can make SEO connect with content design. No, our SEO team used to sit in marketing before I joined, and we still have a part of our SEO activity that does like the paid SEO, but all organic SEO, editorial SEO, the link building, the auditing, all of that good stuff, that now sits under my team. And we have 4 very experienced SEO experts working across that area, and an SEO manager who sits under me. And what we've done is we've been very careful to think what are the SEO specialisms that we need that support content design. So we've actually gone really heavy. We've got 2 technical SEO roles, and we've just released another 2 editorial ones. So actually I think we'll have a total of 4 editorial SEO experts and 2 technical SEO experts. And those editorial content, like kind of content SEO folks, they're really clearly aligned with our content approach. And the way that we've done that is they all share this view of, when you're designing for search engines, you're not designing for the machine, you're designing for the human behavior that sits behind the machine. And actually that's so close to everything we talk about when we talk about designing for accessibility. And in terms of an organization like ours, which is very kind of driven by profits and money, you can make some really compelling arguments for doing things, for taking specific approaches for SEO around the numbers. You can be like, well, we know we're going to do this because it's going to generate £10 million this quarter. But the main reason for making the SEO changes that we have across the team are, we know we're going to take this particular approach to tagging because it makes it much more accessible and actually means that we meet the WCAG guidelines. And we take a human approach to SEO rather than the machine-led. And I think we do a lot of work to make sure our SEO teams are embedded in core projects alongside content designers. Rachel's team, for example, they're working on a big information architecture piece at the moment. And one of the first things we did was move one of the most experienced SEO folks onto that project early, working alongside the content designer, the product designer, and the product owner to make sure SEO was considered alongside content design. So those two things kind of come hand in hand. So we're not one of the, what Sara mentioned on the chat, kind of keyword stuffing is not something that we do anymore. I will say that when I started this job, one of the hills I would die on, and frequently did, like a cat with 9 lives, was that we wouldn't ever have FAQs. BT is a place of 10,000 FAQs if you look across our site. We've made some real efforts to reduce that down to kind of under 1,000 now, but they're still existing. And that's because our SEO team makes such a compelling argument for them. And Thom said, sometimes you just need to defer. And it does, like, you can see, and they're showing you, as we would go with content design and say, this is the evidence that shows it's working. The SEO team come to me and say, well, actually, we must keep this FAQ in place on this particular campaign page because it is driving so much traffic. It's driving, it's generating this amount for the business. And you have to make that call and you go, well, okay, as long as we take the important information that's sitting within that FAQ and the content designer knows that they're embedding it in journeys elsewhere in a unique way without duplicating, those two things can work together. You don't have to take the gov.uk approach of completely eliminating that. And I found myself not dying on that hill as frequently as I had done before. But you can't do that without having those conversations and understanding where they're coming from. But like I say, we're really fortunate. Our team is very much taking that human-centered approach and is happy to have those conversations. They're not just like, computer says no, we must do this because the data says it or the algorithm says it. There's lots of other things at play.
Thank you for that. That's super interesting. I'm going to ask one quick question, Rebecca, before we go to the final interactive activity before we end. Millie was just keen to know how the content community you mentioned earlier at BT have kind of carried on sharing learnings and knowledge throughout kind of being fully remote.
Show and tells, standing up and being vocal, and being a regular presenter at those kind of core ceremonies that we have to make sure that what they're learning is being shared with the wider team. There's more formal things as well. So I mentioned that we have a design system that we're developing out. Anybody can submit like a lesson learned to the design system and kind of build in their work into that and the guidance around it. So people have been submitting kind of things that they found out, bits of learning that they've discovered, and then that kind of gets baked in. We also use Notion a lot to share kind of research and learnings. So kind of you'll have a repository of kind of content design research that you can send a link out to someone if you know they're working on a similar thing, or someone jumps on Slack and says, has anybody done anything on, I don't know, fiber broadband? What have we learned around the messaging? There'll be a repository of messaging guides and some record of the arguments that have been had to get us to a certain point. So it's a mixture of lots of different tools, but actually it does come down a lot to encouraging the individuals to take part in things like show and tells and encouraging them to put their learnings into not into documentation, but into places where other people will see them. And it kind of is a little bit of like an additional part of your role, I guess. So content design is more than doing the work. It's doing the work and then talking about it. One of my managers has written into his team's objectives that they have not finished a piece of work until they've blogged about it, which I think is a great example. So we have a design blog, and if you've done a great piece of content design work, you're not allowed to say, I've put a dot or a period at the end of that sentence until you've blogged about it and your lesson is out in the world and you've told someone about it, which I think it's a lot to ask of somebody a content designer who may not be doing that or may not have time to do that. But actually, it's a good way of making sure that those things are recorded. And and accessed by people just like beyond you and your immediate squad. So yeah, it's a range of things.
Thank you for that. Okay, awesome. So we've sort of coming towards the end of the session now. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Sarah, Thom, and Rebecca for your honesty and your insights this evening. Alice, I believe we're going to do a quick interactive activity before we wrap up.
Yeah, yes, that would be great. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Super insightful and enjoyable. And just to indulge us really one last time, I think, Rachel, if you could share your screen again and head over again to menti.com. We would just really like to know, this was our first thing as Tempo, our first panel. So we just want to know from you, if it's a word cloud, so, you know, no panel is any good without a word cloud. And we just want to know from you what you'd like to see from Tempo in the future. Just a couple of words of things that we could be doing for you all. So yeah, I don't know if it's working.
Is it the same number as last time?
No, I think it's a different number. Let me put that in the chat as well.
That might be why it's...
It's this one this time.
Right. 5, 2, 3, 5, 9, 8, 2. Let's see if this works. Should be able to share my screen. Oh no.
Yeah, so it's working.
Is it working on your... No, it's not this one. It's not tree, sausage and socks. I forgot that. I can't see the link. Alice, you might have to share your screen.
Will it let me? Oh yeah, okay.
If I stop sharing it, we'll let you. While Alice is sharing her screen, just want to say a huge thank you to everybody for coming along this evening as well. It's been lovely to see so many familiar faces. And Rebecca, I think the dog was making a few guest appearances behind you as well.
Yeah, it's working. This is great.
Woo!
Have a word cloud. Oh, brilliant.
It is like brilliant. It's really nice to see some things coming through there. We've got another panel event in September, and the theme for the panel event in September is gaining organisational alignment. And we've got 2 speakers lined up so far. So we've got Patricia Gomez from King in Barcelona, and then we've also got Joni Vandenberg from Airbnb. So the tickets are ready now. You can buy those now. So I think we're going to post a link in the chat for those. But we'll also post it on the Slack group.
I really like the idea of success stories as well coming through. That's a lovely idea, isn't it? Start sharing some successes as well.
Definitely. Yeah, so thank you everybody. We'll wrap up bang on time, or 2 minutes before 7 o'clock. But again, thanks to our speakers. And if you've got some dogs and cats that you'd like to put on the screen, the pets of content design leadership, feel free to get your pet to wave goodbye. I would grab my cat, but she'd probably bite me, so I'm not going to do that. But thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.